Welcome to Praise Hands, home of the Praise Hands, where we are all about creative, cross-cultural Christianity. Today's episode is brought to you by thechurchahead.com, resources and advice for forward-thinking Christian leaders. Today on the Praise Hands podcast, we are halfway through a 3-part series on economic healing. In today's episode, we are back at the ABLE Flagship Store in Nashville, and our guest is last week's co-host, Lexie The Advocate. Lexie's journey as a survivor of sex trafficking will rip your heart to shreds and then put it back together again. Today's content is not recommended for kids, and listener discretion is advised. That said, let's jump right in. All right, I am here today with Lexie The Advocate at the ABLE Flagship Store in Nashville, Tennessee. Hello, Lexie. How's it going?
Hey, good. So excited to be here.
Yeah, this is super fun. There's like people working, making jewelry. There's like really big booths over there. This is a pretty awesome spot.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite places to shop in Nashville. So keeping my attention is difficult right now, to be honest.
I see. You want to go out there and run and just buy everything.
Yeah, I do.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Well, today we're going to be talking about the topic of human trafficking. What is human trafficking?
So human trafficking, a lot of people's first exposure to it was the movie Taken. I don't know if you're familiar with that. The whole I'll find you, I have a special set of skills. Like, it's just this awesome BA dad movie kind of thing. And that was my first exposure to human trafficking as well. But unfortunately, because of that movie and just a lot of really sensationalizing of the issue, people don't actually know what it looks like. And when you Google the definition of human trafficking, you get this paragraph long definition from the UN, which basically boils down to the manipulation of one person for the benefit of another monetarily. Yeah. And so that manipulation could be emotional, physical, mental. But either way, one person is at most gain while another is significantly losing.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful. So what are the main industries or examples of human trafficking today? So
human trafficking looks different really depending on where you are in the world. So in the United States, it's primarily sex trafficking is what we run into most. And even in sex trafficking, there's different types of trafficking that can occur. What goes on in the country looks different than what goes on in the city. It doesn't mean that it's a big city issue. It just is going to look different depending on where you're at. Globally, in other countries, sex trafficking is booming and huge. There's actually a huge problem with people traveling overseas to other countries where they can
American
have sex.
Or things like that.
Yeah, it's called sexcations, where people will fly overseas to have sex with children because it's legal there. Where it's not legal in the United States, there's so much risk here, so they go somewhere else where there's less risk. Yeah. So sex is obviously everywhere, but in other countries too, labor is a huge, huge thing. Most of the things we consume is still on the backs of a slave somewhere. Chocolate, coffee are huge, huge industries. Yeah. A lot of agriculture. Fashion is huge. What a lot of people don't understand is that the reason why they're allowed to get away with that is because the laws in other countries were created in a way years and years and years ago to attract businesses, especially American businesses, to set up camp there. Right. Well, over the years, as the economy has changed and all this stuff, they never changed their wages. So what is a legal wage in a lot of those countries is not livable by any means. Right. And so it's this huge cycle of poverty over and over and over. And so that's what creates vulnerability usually overseas is the need for food and shelter and basic needs. Whereas in the United States, it's different. It's more emotional. It's belonging. It's connection. It's love. Those sort of things.
Got it. So when you say that there's involvement in these industries like chocolate and coffee and things, do you have any feel for the percentages? Is it like if I go and buy a Hershey's chocolate bar, is it more likely than not that slaves were involved with that? Or is it maybe 1 in every 100 might, not that makes it okay, but do you have any feel for that?
It's pretty much 100%. So all of the companies, our major chocolate companies that we know and love, is Hershey, Nestle, Ghirardelli, Dove, all of those huge, huge brands. All of them source their chocolate from farms that enslave children. And there's actually a really great documentary, if anyone wants to learn more about it. It's called The Dark Side of Chocolate, where people actually brought in cameras and revealed, there's 5-year-old kids walking around with machetes, cutting down cocoa beans, and that's their life for their entire life. Wow. And they're not really compensated for that, and they're starving, and I mean, no little kid should be having to do that kind of hard labor.
That's like the majority of chocolate that we eat today. That would be normal for that to be the process that's manufactured in.
Yep, that's completely normal and acceptable in those communities. And the thing that people, just kind of like take it for what it is, like, oh, well, that's just how it is.
Yeah.
Instead of standing up and saying like, no, we're going to stop buying that until you change it. And we're going to start buying these other brands that are fair trade, that have a direct relationship with their supplier and are really intentional about every part of the process in making their product, rather than just, oh, well, we package it together in the United States.
Yeah. You mean all the chocolate's not made in Hershey, Pennsylvania?
No. Most of it is from the west coast of Africa.
Yeah. Wow. That's tragic, and I think something that not a lot of people are aware of.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you personally are a survivor of human trafficking.
I am.
In as much detail as you feel comfortable, I want to give you an opportunity to share your story and let our listeners hear. So what was your life like before, during, and after the time where you were actively being trafficked?
Yeah, so my story is actually really shocking to a lot of people, because I grew up in a normal middle-class family. We went to church like every time the doors were open. My mom was actually led like in the youth group, so very involved in our community, very involved in our faith community, and I had a very involved family. But here's where the problem came in, was A, human trafficking wasn't even really talked about. No one knew what it was when it was happening to me. B, my family thought that nothing even remotely like that could ever happen to our family, because we were a good family. Like we loved each other, we looked out for one another, but that's exactly where the vulnerability started, because it wasn't even on their radar. So my grandmother took in a boy in her neighborhood he was around 15, 16 years old, and he came from just a really broken home. And so she was having him over for dinner, just making sure, he knew someone was cared and was taking after him. Well, they didn't really monitor how he was spending time with me. And it was just kind of like, we accepted him as part of the family, regardless of his background and his personal issues.
And how old were you at this time?
I was like 9.
Okay.
Yeah. When I first met him. And so it started off, as a friendship. And like all predators do, they usually start, especially with children, with games. And so we would be playing wrestling or even just video games or something like that, and it would turn into a tickle fight, and then it would just kind of evolve from there. And he went through what, could be called a grooming process with me for about a year. And then he basically had me convinced that he loved me, cared about me, and that I thought that I was his girlfriend. Even though in my mind I was like, I'm pretty sure he probably has a real girlfriend in high school. Yeah. But that was the only way I could make sense of any of it. And the point in which it turned to trafficking was the summer of, I was probably 10 years old. And he invited me to come over to his house, and he'd have me pretend like I was riding my bike around the neighborhood, which was a normal activity for me. And there was a way where you could take this path and it would cut across to his backyard. And so I did that. And when I got there, there was someone there that I'd never seen or met before. And I kind of knew, in my stomach, something is really off, but I don't know what to do. And so I got there, and he had been teaching me up until this point how to dance for him. And so he basically commanded me to dance for his friend, and I was just scared and didn't know what else to do. And so I did, and his friend paid him. And then his friend asked if he could have more, essentially, and he sold me to his friend for $100. And that's such a weird moment. It's time stood still, and I was like, what does that even mean? What is about to happen right now?
This was all in front of you, that the whole transaction took place?
Yeah, it was all in front of me, not a secret. And prior to all this happening, he had raped me violently and threatened me and told me if I ever said anything to someone that he would do the same thing to my younger sister.
I see.
So
you knew that wasn't something that was right. Because I think I've heard maybe some survivors that are I just didn't know what was going on, but you knew like, hey, this is wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know why, because I actually hadn't had the sex talk yet. So I didn't even have like the vocabulary to even, if I wanted to talk to someone about it, to even tell them like what was going on. Yeah. It was just kind of like this, it's the Holy Spirit in all of us, right? Like it's our conscience telling us like, this is wrong, this is off. But I just didn't really know why because I was so little. Yeah. And so from then, so basically he took me upstairs, threw me out his friend, and I was just like in total shock, like the whole time. Yeah. And it was a very quick transaction. And after that, he had me come over to his house again with a couple of friends, and they had video cameras, and they basically videotaped them raping me. And that's how, that was during that time, it was like early 2000s, so dawn of internet porn, right? And that is how they advertised me in the community. So that's the only way I can put it all together, because after that, men would randomly show up at his house, and I was told to go over there whenever I saw that. And if I didn't,
this whole time you were still living at your parents' house, and then they just thought you were going on a bike ride, and you were instructed to basically lie about it or pretend that you were going on a bike ride.
Well, I was living, so I lived at home. I spent a lot of time at my grandmother's. Okay. And so they just basically planned it based upon when I happened to be around. And as things went on, it was very clear he was involved in some kind of organized crime group. There was always other men there kind of as like protectors. They took the money. There was like lots of other factors going on. It wasn't just like this teenage kid running this ring out of his house. Like he definitely had help.
Yeah. So that continued for how long?
That continued for, I guess, like 2 years. And the reason it ended was not because I told someone or someone found out. And that's probably the most frustrating thing people have with my story, because there's no sense of, quote, quote, justice. Sure. But I hit puberty and they weren't interested anymore. And so there's actually this season of these men that were abusing me, rejecting me, because of how much they hated me and despised my body, that it was like becoming a woman and I wasn't a child anymore. So that's how it ended. Like they literally just rejected me and let me go. Wow. Yeah.
So that's crazy. Thank you for sharing that story. So when it stopped, you were probably around 12 years old or so?
12, 13,
How did you move on from there? And I mean, I saw a video, I think that you posted on Instagram, of you forgiving this man and I think this group of people. How did you move on from there? And eventually, how did you find the power to forgive?
Yeah. It was years. And a lot of it, I didn't remember a lot of it. And so it wasn't until college that I really started dealing with a lot of stuff. And until then, there was a buildup of lots of issues. I had an eating disorder. I was cutting. I was just consumed with anxiety and depression. I couldn't sleep, just all this stuff. And finally hit my point where I was like, and I felt a calling to help other people. And I knew if I didn't get help, there was no way I could help anyone else. You can't, give water from a dry well. So I kind of started my healing process. And part of that for me was just a lot of education. I was at the time getting a degree in psychology. And the thing about forgiveness is, I feel like my idea growing up was, I don't know if your parents did this or not, like if your siblings got in a fight and you're like, hug it out, like tell them you're sorry and give them a hug. Yeah. And so that was like my concept. I was like, I don't want to freaking give these people a hug and like, but that's the thing is like reconciliation and forgiveness are completely different things, and reconciliation is not required to forgive. Reconciliation isn't always safe and right. Like you don't have to do that. That's like truly a choice of your own. It's not like, I don't think that's a biblically mandated thing, especially in cases of like severe abuse. And so the way I came to forgive was that the Lord gave me compassion and empathy for them through learning about what causes people to do the things they do. And once I took a step out of my own shoes and everything he did and the awful stuff said and all of these horrible things, and took a look at his life, and how sad it was. Like, he didn't have a family. His mom was never in the picture. His dad was a drunk. Not that that makes it okay. By no means is forgiveness saying, yeah, what you did is okay. Like, have a good life. I realized that it was instead me, this whole time I've been holding onto his hand, like with this death grip, because I was angry. And it was just a matter of me letting go. Yeah. Like, it's that, that sounds so oversimplified, but that really is all that it is. It was me saying, you know what, God, your word says vengeance is yours, not mine. Like, it's not mine to go out and seek and to create this sense of justice. That's your job, and that's who you are. And so I took him at his word, and I was like, I'm going to leave that to you, and I'm going to walk away from this, and he's your problem, not mine. Yeah. Wow. And that was that. Yeah.
Obviously now you're sharing your story. You're able to be a resource and an encouragement to people that have gone through similar things as you. Do you feel like you would be where you are today if you hadn't been able to forgive?
No way. Because until, like, you fully move forward, there's not space in your life to receive anything else. So if I got my hands full of a bunch of garbage, I can't take anything new that God has for me or that someone else might have for me. So yeah, no, I would totally be stuck in the same, like, dark cycle that I was for most of my life. Wow. No, that's really powerful. I think that is applicable not only in cases of human trafficking or sex trafficking, but just in general to everybody listening to this. You know, the things that we go through, a lot of times we can hold on to them for a long time, and to the point where it's actually stopping us from being who we were made to be, you know, just the inability to forgive. And I think your story is a great example of someone who has really been able to move beyond that with God's help. So thank you for sharing all that. Yeah, absolutely. And really it boils down to, like, I'm not defined by the one thing that happened to me 15 years ago. And neither is he. He's not either. The thing that he did to me, his existence isn't defined by that. We're not just one thing that happened or that we do. Right.
Jesus died for him just as much as he died for you.
Right.
Yeah. That's so good. Time for a quick commercial break. Today's episode is brought to you by thechurchahead.com, resources and advice for forward-thinking Christian leaders. If you have questions about human trafficking, supply chains, or other issues of economic healing, stop by thechurchahead.com to sign up for a free 30-minute coaching call with Lexie LaValle or myself. In addition to coaching, The Church Ahead also offers contracting and courses. So surf on over or call 615-538-8778. Now, back to our show. So you've linked arms with different organizations, including ABLE, where we are today, Street Grace in Atlanta, and I'm sure many more. Recently, you collaborated with an organization called Fight the New Drug, which educates the public with data on the harmful personal and social effects of pornography. What did this collaboration look like, and what does human trafficking have to do with pornography?
Yeah. So Fight the New Drug is an incredible organization. They just put out, like, the best content, and it's scientifically backed. There's no way to argue that pornography affects our brains in such significant ways, just as much as if you were shooting up with heroin. It's literally exactly the same biologically. And so I found them years and years ago and have reached out to collaborate in different things. And so they wanted to put together a documentary, basically illustrating how pornography affects the brain, the heart, relationships, and then connects to the world. Wow. So my part in that was how it connects to the world, and how what you do in private isn't just for you, how it connects to these global issues like human trafficking. And so, and this is super common of pretty much most survivors I've met and talked to, that and this happened to me too. I was forced to watch porn, so I knew what was expected of me. Wow. Because porn just, it inspires stuff. Like, I mean, if you think of different movies or different things that you've watched that have impacted you, you don't forget them. Right. And that's not to say every single person that watches pornography is going to go pay for sex. Sure. You know what I mean? However, there's this guy, his name is Victor Malrek, I think I said his name right. Sure. He's European, amazing, and he wrote this book called Johns, and it's all about the men who purchase women and, like, why every single one of them, pornography was a huge tie. And it's because it's an addiction. And any addiction, it drives you to pushing the limit. Like, how far can I take this?
Right.
Until literally one of the quotes in there is, the guy says, I was looking at porn. The next thing I knew, I was in my car looking for the real thing.
Right. Porn with skin on it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, and just because you don't go out and buy someone doesn't mean it's not affecting you. Mm-hmm. Like, you don't have to wait till it's like this extreme like thing before you actually deal with it. Because the reality is it's affecting you in your daily life. Because all addictions numb your emotions, it numbs your capacity to have solid relationships with people, even with God. Like, it just numbs everything because your focus ends up being that. And even if you're not in a place where you're constantly thinking about it, like, oh, when's the next time or whatever, it'd be like putting a little bit of crack in your water bottle. Like, it's not going to get you high or anything. Like, why would you do that? Like, you know, like poisoning your source. Like, you're just constantly kind of doing that. And so that's kind of how it all connects. And it was really awesome to work with them.
And has that documentary come out yet, or is it still going to be, is it coming out soon? Or?
Yeah, that documentary is out. It's called brainheartworld.com or .org. I'm not sure which.
Okay. We'll put that information in the show notes.
Yeah, perfect.
Wow. I'm looking forward to checking that out. So you've shared about how your faith has helped you find the power to forgive. I want to read a quote that is from the Greek philosopher Plato. He says that justice consists in the superior ruling over and having more than the inferior. This Greco-Roman view was universally accepted at the time of Christ. How is the concept of justice and human dignity presented by Christianity different?
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people still kind of hold on to that eye for an eye thing. Mm-hmm. And that's where a lot of people in my own story have such a hard time knowing, well, those people are still out there. Mm-hmm. Like, they weren't thrown in jail and given the death sentence or like something like that. And I've thought about that. And to me, that I wouldn't feel better if that happened. Yeah. Sure, it would be nice for them to not have access to anyone else. Yeah. But to me, and from just what I've studied in the Bible, justice is who God is. Mm-hmm. And justice, like Jesus was justice. Mm-hmm. And his way of doing that is so beyond anything that like we can try to figure out. Mm-hmm. And it's synonymous with grace. Mm-hmm. And so to me, like the things that happened to me, for it to be made right would be for those people to be saved and their hearts to be changed. Because when you throw someone in a cell, it doesn't change them. Mm-hmm. It does nothing. It, in fact, makes them worse most of the time. And they come back out and they go back in and they do, it's a huge cycle. And so, this idea for an eye doesn't do anything. It doesn't create any sort of change. And justice is making something right. Mm-hmm. And so if it's not going to make something right by ending the cycle, by changing a person or whatever, then that's not justice, it's revenge.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's well said. So social justice is really impossible without a sense of personal renewal.
Yeah, absolutely.
How would you recommend, as someone that is very familiar with this issue of human trafficking and acknowledging both the individual responsibility of players involved as well as the really systemic issues going on, what are the best ways moving forward for people listening to this episode to make a practical difference in this fight?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I just want to acknowledge anyone that's listened this long. It's not easy to listen to stuff like this and to hear how horrible and dark people can actually be. And a lot of people are like, oh, it just feels so big. And so like you get so overwhelmed so easy. But the reality is God has already given each person listening the gift to make a difference. Whatever your interest is, whether you're a musician, a writer, a business person, you know, there's so many different ways that God can activate the gifts and talents he's already given you to apply to different areas. And if anyone wants help in figuring that out, I actually love helping people do that.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Feel free to find my information in the notes and just send me a message. But some really practical stuff can just be switching what you buy. Mm-hmm. Instead of buying Hershey, Nestle, buy something that's fair trade. Mm-hmm. It's going to cost a little bit more, but the reality is that cost difference is someone's life. And so to me, that's worth it. I'm you know what? I'm going to give a single mom overseas somewhere a little bit more money, and I'm okay with that. Yeah. Doing simple things like that, researching what you like, some of your favorite brands, and seeing what their supply chain is like. And if you really can't find out, then that's kind of telling. And if it makes you angry, say something, write them a letter, create a campaign with your friends, and like start sending letters and talking about it. The more we talk about it, the better. And awareness really is the first step, but it can't stop there. And so like, there's so many people, like I love, Shine a Light Day, where everyone puts a red X on their hand, and it's great. However, so many people stop there and they don't do anything else to further educate themselves. Right. It's like, even like parents learning like how traffickers are using technology and how they're accessing their kids and what they can do about that. There's so many things, and none of it requires you to like be a clinical therapist or a lawyer or, someone of like super high authority. And like, here's a great example. There's a girl, she's a photographer, and she traveled the country and took photos of survivors of sex trafficking. This was years ago, and it was like the first time I'd ever really seen myself and realized like how beautiful I was. So something like that.
Through her art.
Just through her coming and taking photos.
Wow.
And that is so healing. Wow. So things that simple, like just, you can't underestimate anything that you have. If you feel like you have nothing, you have something. Even if you don't feel like you have a skill, you can go clean at a domestic violent women's shelter. Like, the options are totally endless. And the reality is these people are everywhere, and people that are vulnerable to it are absolutely everywhere. So when you serve those communities, like the homeless community, the refugee communities, people that are suffering through domestic violence or have been raped, or foster kids, like when you're touching those people's lives and showing them love, you're taking their vulnerability down.
Yeah. Wow. So we've talked a little bit about individuals and what we can do. What about organizations or churches, like groups of people?
I think the biggest thing to start is definitely education. I have a friend, he just published a book called Vulnerable. His name is Raleigh Sadler, and he is definitely the leading voice on like, how do you do that? Like, how does the church get involved in this in a really practical way? And it really does boil down to just being involved in your community and into the lives of the people that are most vulnerable, which is, like we've said, the homeless, the refugees, like, all the troubled, the most troubled and hurt people and broken people and ugly people. That's where it's at. So there's so many great anti-trafficking organizations across the country. I also travel and train people, but having a professional come in and really speak to your field and what that looks like, and help kind of strategize, like, okay, like, how can we do more? So training for parents is going to look super different than training for doctors and nurses. But really, everybody is intersecting the lives of people that are being trafficked. They're not held in cages and stuff. Like, people kind of have this idea of like, well, they're just stashed away somewhere, and like, that's why we never see them. No, like, they're out in the world with all of us. And the reason they are able to do that is because they've been brainwashed and they're too fearful to leave. And so they're getting their nails done with you and their hair done, and they're at the grocery store, and they're sitting next to you at a table at a restaurant. And so having the right people kind of come in to speak into your field or figure out how you can activate your community is really huge. And then it takes the burden off of you. So really all you have to do is advocate to the leaders in your community, like, hey, I think this is really, really important, and we need to bring this person in, and just kind of keep driving. You just have to ask over and over and over, and it'll happen.
Right. So specifically for sex trafficking, do you feel like there need to be any changes legislatively, or do you feel like the right pieces are already in place?
In many ways, a lot of good has been done. It's illegal in every single state. There is still a lot more that needs to happen, and the best organization that I know of that is really leading the charge on legislation is Shared Hope International. And they actually have a grading scale. So you can go and see what your state's grade is for legislation. And then it'll give you pointers on, okay, here's what you need to go advocate for.
That's really good.
Yeah. And a lot of things that are really missing in legislation is resourcing for survivors. Sometimes we can have access to violent crimes against children or different things like that. But it's very difficult to access, and trauma of this kind affects the mind and the body in such a deep and profound and like no one has even been able to like fully wrap research around all of it type of way that it's really difficult to recover from, and they need a lot of help. And I think that's a great place for the church to even step in, like providing free counseling and like nutrition care and housing and just all kinds of stuff is a great way for people to kind of step in and fill that gap.
Yeah, that's super good. Okay, so we've talked about your story. Let's move on to looking at kind of maybe some of the more social impacts of this issue of human and sex trafficking. A lot of people are what do they call them now? Slacktivists or something like that, where you post something, one day a year and you feel like, oh man, I'm making a difference. But the implications of our lives tell a different story. And when it comes to things like the media, whether that's in music or movies, things like that, I'll remember, I think Justin Timberlake a few years ago at the Super Bowl, totally dehumanizing women and objectifying them. And I didn't hear anybody from the media giving him any pushback. That was seen as normal and as acceptable. What has been the portrayal of this issue of sex trafficking through the media, and do you feel like it needs to change?
Yeah, it definitely needs to change, because some of like the top songs, if you actually like listen, just pull up the lyrics, don't even listen to the song, you're like, oh my gosh, like how are we still allowing this, like this type of language and this type of portrayal of women, that their only purpose is to like bend over and dance at a club. And sorry if that's graphic, but that's literally what most of our media portrays, is this objectifying of women and making men like these complete sexual beings that are only made to conquer. And there's so much more to men than that. There's so much more to women than our bodies. And but just kind of keeps continuing over and over. And so what's happening is it's shifting the mindset of a lot of young kids. And when a trafficker approaches them online, and they're like, hey, I saw you like this music video.
They might see it as an opportunity for them.
Absolutely. And they present it as that. And their kids are like, oh, yeah, sure. Like, that's totally normal. People do that all the time. It's not a big deal. Yeah. Not realizing that they're exchanging so much of their soul, and they're neglecting to develop, like, who they are in exchange for this just one thing for some money or whatever. Yeah. And so, the media and the way it is conditioning us is an issue in and of itself that definitely has to be shifted. And I think the only way it shifts is kind of in the same way like the feminist movement and different things like that, just calling attention to this, like, hey, we're not okay with that. We're not buying your album. We're not going to your concert. Like, calling artists and producers and the industry to a higher standard is absolutely necessary. Yeah,
no, that's so good. I think a friend of mine was a substitute teacher in an elementary school, and she said she was shocked because the cool kids on campus were the ones that posted the craziest things on YouTube, and that gave them their superiority, and they were the big people on campus because they were willing to do things other people weren't. And that's kind of the culture that we see on this next generation that is being fed by the media, that is being fed by the advertising, user-generated content culture that we live in. And so it's a big issue. And I think, looping back to something you said earlier about the responsibility of parents, it's really a 360 issue. This isn't just an isolated issue that just affects one part of our lives. It involves mothers and fathers being present in their families' lives. It involves an economy that can allow their parents to be in their kids' lives. And it takes a set of values that provides humans with inherent dignity more than just what they can do. So it's really an issue that affects a lot of aspects of our culture. And I think I'm glad to see people fighting for this. And I just know that there's so much more that we can do. And I'm excited to see what comes next.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you, Lexie, so much for sharing your story. I'm going to put your information in the show notes so people can learn more about what you're doing if they want help figuring out how they can practically make a difference in this issue, whether it's an organization or an individual. We're cheering you on and are excited to see what God does with your life from here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Man, what a story. It's crazy that there are kids not only on the other side of the world, but here in our own cities that are both victims and perpetrators of this. If you've got kids, give them an extra hug tonight. Whether it's in our churches, workplaces, online communities, or even in our purchasing decisions, Let's be agents of righteousness, bringing hope and healing wherever we go. Next week on the Praise Hands podcast, we're going to hear from an absolute legend. But before I tell you about that, I've got 3 things for you. Last week, I asked for your help with algorithmic evangelism. That means the more people that rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, the more people their algorithms promote it to. So your review can help put this podcast in front of literally thousands more people. So thank you for your support. Second, if you text the word Robbie to 72727, I'll send you a text every Monday with reading recommendations that are inspiring my journey of creative cross-cultural Christianity. And third, Praise Hands is much more than a podcast. To learn more about our community, visit praisehands.com and click Get Involved. Our guest next week is a world-renowned economist and peace negotiator, Dr. Michael Schluter. He's pretty much done it all. He's been honored by the Queen of England for his biblically derived economic policy, and he's also held peace negotiations everywhere from Korea to Rwanda to South Africa during apartheid. You're not going to want to miss this. This is the Praise Hands podcast, and I'm your host, Robbie Valderrama. We'll see you next week.